皆さん、こんにちは。ビジネス Success Japan のポッドキャストへようこそ。Hello everyone and welcome to the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your host, Liddy Buchelman. This podcast is made for those who want to develop or strengthen the communication skills, cultural savvy, insights into current trends and conditions, and mindsets that are essential in a Japanese business environment. The helpful, practical suggestions and engaging insights offered here provide listeners with the in-depth cultural context needed to achieve their own version of success while collaborating with Japanese counterparts. Today, I'm very excited to finally share a recording of the first ever live Business Success Japan podcast episode. I was lucky enough to get 3 former guests of the podcast to meet up in person at the Tokyo Comedy Bar in Shibuya, which was kind enough to host us. If you haven't checked out the Tokyo Comedy Bar already, be sure to click on the link in the description of this episode to learn more about them. Thanks again for hosting us. I will also include links to my guests' previous interviews for anyone who wants to go back and listen, but I'll just sneak in a quick introduction for them here as well. Katheryn Gronauer is an executive coach who helps leaders find their footing. She has expertise in leadership, cross-cultural transition, and work-life balance. Katheryn is also a TEDx speaker, author, and has been featured in publications including the Japan Times, HuffPost, and Women's Health magazine. Anthony Griffin is a marketer and communication coach who helps Japanese companies market to international audiences. Before founding Saga Consulting, he served as the marketing and communications manager for the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. As a communications coach, he has been credited for helping Fortune 500 executives earn global-level promotions. He also runs Kokoro Media, which represents a network of authors exploring the heart of Japan through travel, people, language, and culture. And the final guest in today's conversation is Austin Zeng, who is the founder of Mixed Scholars Association and lecturer for career development for foreign students in Japan. He also works as a freelance programmer and translator. He is a University of Tokyo 2017 graduate and is currently living in Singapore. And now, without any further delay, let's get into today's very special conversation. All right. Well, welcome everyone to the very first live recording of the Business Success Japan podcast. I really appreciate all of you coming all the way up to Shibuya, to Tokyo Comedy Bar. And also for my distinguished guests today, would you mind briefly introducing yourself to the audience?
Hi everyone, Austin here, Singaporean, have been in Japan for 12 years, currently working as an engineer, but I do translation and interpretation as well as career education for foreign students in Japan. Glad to be here.
Hey everyone, my name is Katheryn Gronauer. I'm originally from Florida and I've been in Tokyo since 2009, and I currently work as a coach and a trainer. So I work with people who are in leadership positions, who are experiencing some type of cross-cultural challenge in Japan, and who are looking to level up without burning out. It's really great to be here.
Thank you for coming, everyone. I'm Anthony Griffin, originally from California. I've been here living and working in Japan for 15 years now, and basically I help Japanese companies market and communicate abroad. So thank you for coming. Looking forward to your questions.
Great. Well, thank you for coming out here and sharing your time and broad range of experience with everyone today. Everyone here is also a former guest of the Business Success Japan podcast. So if you ever want to learn more about them and their experiences, you can go back and listen to those, though some of them are quite old. So maybe just wait and ask a little bit more about them while we're here. So just to get things started today, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about everybody's experience in Japan and how they feel like their experience in Japan has affected them or their growth as a person.
Okay, so I guess I'm first up. So I think mine's kind of interesting. So I came here at the age of 20 with the MEC scholarship, and I did my undergraduate here. So my experience is shaped by my having to go through college in Japan and writing my thesis in Japanese and things along those lines. And I think like for me, I think all of us here kind of share the same experience that the Japan that we saw from the outside is not exactly the Japan that we see from the inside. And there's that gap, but the bigger question is, how do you deal with that gap? Because some of it is very positive, some of that is not as positive, right? And I feel like it's pretty much me growing as a person, trying to like tease out the nuances of how I may find my path as a person and my career as well. Like through all these complexities and these nuances that you can't really see from outside. This is the abstract. I think we're going to go into the concrete later, so let's just keep it at this. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll go next. So that's a really great question. I came to Japan for university and I forgot to go home. I just really enjoyed being here. And I was like, you know what? I'm bilingual. Why not just continue to stay here and get a job? You know, all my friends are here. And so I really just enjoyed, starting to work here. I had really good relationships. And it actually wasn't until I was maybe a couple years into my business where I decided to make Japan my home. So it might sound like I had some type of plan to be here for as long as I have been, but I actually wasn't really thinking too long term at the time. So it was really when I was in the midst of doing my business where I was like, look, I think I actually have to put down roots and really make a decision because that's really going to help me think a little bit more from the business standpoint too. I think how Japan has affected me is I know for sure that I would be working in personal development or professional development regardless of where I would be living in the world. But I think what makes it different about being in Japan is that I've been doing cross-cultural education training. So what's interesting, I'm half Japanese and half American. I feel like sometimes people will hire me just because of who I am, as a person and my lived experience. And so that's one question I have for myself is if I ever did move to another location to continue being a coach and a trainer, what would be my unique selling proposition? How would my life as a coach be different in another area? So I'll also leave it at that.
Well, I guess I'm the odd man out here because I did not come to Japan until I was 29. And at first I thought that was a disadvantage. My colleagues were all younger than me, fresh out of university. I was the quote unquote old guy. But then as I worked, and at this time I was basically in the business English instruction field, I realized that it was an advantage that I came here after earning my master's degree, after working in marketing in the States, because I could bring that experience here and move up the corporate ladder faster. So in other words, for people listening, if you feel that you're late coming to Japan, you can flip that script and it can become an advantage. As far as how my 15 years have impacted me, there are a few ways. First, Japan has taught me patience. Everything from getting your internet hooked up to the entire sales process takes longer than where I'm from in the States. And that's okay, but we have to learn to accept that and work within that as well. Secondly, Japan has taught me to, I guess as Jocko Willink, the ex-Navy SEAL says, to take extreme ownership of what I do. So in Japan in business, you have to apologize profusely if something goes wrong. And an excuse is not part of that apology. So for a real simple example, let's say I'm going to visit a client and there's an accident on the train tracks or something like that, and the train is late. Technically, that's not my fault, but I need to learn how to take ownership of something like that. For example, I should have left early to account for that. So learning to take that extreme ownership of my actions is one way that Japan has influenced me. And finally, the biggest way is just being out of my comfort zone almost 100% of the time. Every day there's a new language or cultural challenge that I have to figure out. So for sometimes that's stressful, but I feel it's helped me grow at a faster rate than I would have if I were in the States. So yeah, those are the main ways that Japan has impacted me.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And just given kind of the stereotypical image of the foreigner coming to Japan, it can be easy to think, oh, I'm late. Oh, I don't fit the right mold to be successful in Japan. But as you've all demonstrated, you can each have very different career paths, and in turn, you'll learn different lessons just based on your background. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I am just a little bit curious about what drove you to stay in Japan, either indefinitely or just for such a long time.
The food for sure. I can go like months without having miso soup, but the second I'm off the plane in another country, I'm like, where is it? How can I be here, without my miso soup? And I'm actually pretty serious when I say that. I think the food is a really big reason why I'm here. And, things are just so easily accessible. The lifestyle is just really, easy. I've been thinking about lifestyle in Japan a lot lately because, the last time I spoke with Lydia was just a couple of years ago. And back then I was just primarily a business owner who was in a relationship, but now I am married and I have a child. So, things about like my future in Japan and, going through the experience of seeing my child go into, local daycares and things like that, it's really adding a new perspective. But yeah, in terms of what has kept me here thus far, I would say just the comfort of the lifestyle for sure.
Okay, yeah. What has kept me here from the beginning and to this day, Japan just vibes with me, my character, my personality. So even though I look different, sometimes act different, I've always felt relatively comfortable here, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. But beyond that, Japan has just presented opportunity after opportunity after opportunity here, and that has kept me here. There were probably 3 or 4 times where I was ready to go back, and the next career opportunity appeared, and I had to pursue it. And eventually it reached the point where I didn't know what I would do if I went back to the US. My livelihood is now tied to this country. And then, as Katheryn mentioned, I'm married, so I have family. I have roots here now. So this is, my home, basically. So that's why I'm still here.
So I'm going last for this because I am technically not staying here anymore, and my main residence is back in Singapore. But so the question for me is, why have I stayed so long, and also by extension, why I'm moving, right? So let's look at it chronologically. At the point that I graduated from university, there was always the choice for me to go back home to Singapore. And I personally, this is my personal opinion, I felt that would have been a waste, because student life in Japan is not shakaijin, or working life in Japan. And for me to just move back to Singapore made me feel like I was missing a big chunk of understanding Japan, understanding how the society worked. But after that, so that was the first impetus. After that, it became opportunities and opportunities. One example, I am a political science graduate, but it is because of Japan's way of doing especially early career development that I became an engineer. So that's one example of that. And tapping on other things like how, for example, I can do both languages. So I end up doing freelance projects for, copywriting, or copywriting and translating for a luxury sofa company in Hiroshima. And it's all these kind of things where you kind of grow into the niches of the market which no one else is filling, and that has paid off very well for me so far in my career here in Japan. And as for why I'm moving out, therefore, I've got my partner back in Singapore, so I think it's more home over there right now.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I was just a little bit curious about how you even went about finding your special niche in Japan. What did that process look like for you?
For me, it just started from having lots of time back in college. And so I was like, oh, it's the mid 2010s. It's probably a good time to learn programming. And then there's just where it picked up from. Went into an internship. Internship said that you can do A. So can you do B? I learned how to do B. B became C, D, E, F, G. And that's pretty much what happened for the coding side of things. And as for the other freelance translation interpretation, is just keeping your door open, meeting people. I think this counts, right? Yeah, meeting people and just being around them in people's an active imagination. And there's a ton of weird networking hacks that I think that we can talk about later, about how you get into people's active imagination. I think we'll talk about that later. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Did either of you have anything to add to finding your specific niche in Japan, or even choosing which opportunities to pursue versus which ones to pass up on?
Sure. I think the question about niche in general is always evolving. When I first started, I was all over the place. My primary thing I wanted to help people with was health and wellness. And I also wasn't 100% sure that I would be living in Japan. So I was really just spreading my marketing like everywhere. So I had people I was interacting with in Europe and, the United States and New Zealand and all these different places. And it was getting really hard to kind of figure out how to just, get that a little bit more narrowed. But then, a lot of the people I was working with in Japan, they were having more specific challenges. Like, I want to get healthy, but I don't know how to shop in a grocery store. Or like I, want to have better work-life balance, but I've been really stressed out because of the culture in, my profession. So kind of just being able to meet people where they were at and kind of use a combination of coaching and training. I felt like that's something where I was like, oh, this is something where I know this is an area I know I can really help people in. And then that also evolved to helping people who are senior leaders, who are having more business challenges, or they have kind of a little bit more weight in the work that they're doing and the impact that they want to make. So I think it's just always been an evolution, and it continues to be. So yeah, who knows where I'll be, 5 years from now.
Great. Thank you so much. And how about you, Anthony?
Yeah, I like to think I created my own niche, and I say that because my niche came to be by paying attention when I was working for my employers. So basically, my current business, there's two sides to it. There's the digital marketing and communication side, but there's also a coaching side, similar to you, Katheryn, as well. But I focus on Japanese executives and professionals who want to conduct business in the States or abroad. And all of that came from simply working for organizations and companies that were offering similar services. And I really paid attention to what their customer pain points were and what their needs were. And going through that process and noticing that, I started to build my own business in the background. And over time, people started to approach me directly saying, oh, can you run our LinkedIn page, for example? Or can you prepare me to network or run meetings in the States, for example? And ultimately, a business was created that has two kind of different services, but I do have clients that use both. They use the marketing side and the coaching side, and I don't know of many other organizations or sole proprietors doing that. So yeah, niches are important, and if people listening are, if you're working for your employer, if you're doing your job, pay attention to what your customers or what your company's customers really need.
Great. And just going off of kind of like the general wisdom, or at least I guess the LinkedInification of general wisdom, where people just kind of try to find their niche and focus only on what you're good at. Do that. Keep making your focus as small as possible. Whereas in reality, there's just a lot more play involved. You have to explore things. You have to go where you feel like you are being pulled in the market. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think one kind of piece of advice that I heard that was kind of helpful in this area is to think of your niche as like an hourglass. So at first, you might just try to be a little bit more open to helping people with a variety of pain points. And then at some point, you have to realize, okay, maybe there's things that I'm being asked to do that I actually don't want to do. And what are the areas where I actually feel like I could maximize? And so that's where you start to narrow it down, kind of like the middle part of the hourglass. And then you can start to try to build back out maybe the suite of services that you have for those specific people in the areas that you do feel are, more valuable. So, yeah, I feel like my experience has definitely been like that hourglass.
Yeah, for sure. And I was just curious if there's anything that you can think of off the top of your head that you think you would have benefited from knowing before you decided to put down roots in Japan, either personally or in the career sense.
Well, everyone's looking at me, so I'll jump in on this one. And I have conversations with sole proprietors about this a lot, including Ozan, who is here in the audience. I wish I had either known more about or thought more about basically immigration law. The reason being, again, I came here a little bit late, and I knew what it was like to work and freelance and things in my own country. And when you're working in your own country, if your business fails or you lose your job, you don't have to worry about getting kicked out of the country, usually. Hopefully not. You pick yourself back up, you try to find your next job, start your next business. However, if you move to a country like Japan, you have a critical point of failure with your immigration status. Now, if you start a fully incorporated company, a kabushiki gaisha, godo gaisha, you're probably okay. But there's a lot of kind of gray areas if you're a sole proprietor, and you really have to know immigration law, make sure that you're doing everything correctly, hire legal help. And I think I would have done some things differently if I had studied that before. But instead, I just started working, started my sole proprietorship, and had some challenging surprises along the way. Nothing bad, just things that made doing business a little bit more difficult. So I really wish that before coming here, I had looked into how Japan's immigration law works. And to be specific, it's not that it's bad or evil or anything like that, but it's what I call a black box. There's a lot of mystery, there's a lot of uncertainty, and to give concrete advice, it's probably a good idea to consult with a professional before you do anything. So those are my thoughts. Everybody else?
I think I'll answer that question. Actually, to address immigration law first, I think we generally have this idea that immigration law in Japan is strict. But when we actually open the details of it, there's actually lots of things which look quite loose from overseas. The fact, for example, that your work visa here does not restrict you for working for your sole employer, for example. That's a career opportunity in itself. So there's all these nuances to tease out, right? And you really do only get this information if you have either done it yourself and kind of experience your own failures, right? And or you consult with a professional on this. So echoing your point. Now, as for the question, which was, what would I have wanted to know before coming here to Japan? I'm going to answer things from a more personal perspective. So honestly, I had the Japan angst. And I think many people here do know what that Japan angst means. When the first year that I came, and it was a lot of culture shock, about how people, the conversations that you have and these kind of things. I had all of that. And so there was a bit of a time where I was kind of in the glut, an emotional glut and stuff like that. It happens. But so to answer that question, what would I tell myself if I were to go back those 12 years and if I was in that emotional state? I would say that, Japan, for all it's worth, right? It plays a certain game. We cannot really blame Japan for not playing our preferred game, because in that case, then you shouldn't have come in your first place, right? And for all it's worth, Japan is where it is because the game, in some form or way, has worked and has worked since World War II. So you learn. You find your own spin on the game, and that will propel you forward instead of blaming the game for what it is. So that's my own advice I would have given to myself 13 years ago.
Ooh, so I think for me, I just wish that I was aware that there was so much support out there. So I came as an undergrad, and so basically, if you come as an exchange student, the school will help you with everything from your visa to bank accounts, all those things. They get it all set up for you. But since I had come as an undergrad, I didn't have any support in terms of figuring out where I was going to live and all those things. And so I had the mindset that I had to do everything myself. And I think that's just pretty much it. Just don't believe that you have to do everything yourself when you're here. There's always someone who has been where you're currently, experiencing challenges. And there's definitely people that you can consult with for advice. So, I think that's pretty much the gist of it is don't assume that you're alone in your experience.
Yeah, and if you're currently suffering from the angst of living in Japan, it can be really hard to even notice that there are people there who want to help you and there are resources available to you. So practicing that radical acceptance can sometimes get you to a place where you can actually look for and accept help from others. So it's definitely an important mindset to try to cultivate while you're here. So then
if you've stayed in Japan for so long, it must be because there are some opportunities that are unique to Japan. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind highlighting some of those for us.
I guess for me, like to bring it back to my answer from just now, it's the first thing is not being pigeonholed by what I studied. So that was the biggest thing. But right now, I think all of us will kind of agree that there is a bigger demand for people who get Japan and can do overseas work than there is supply. So there is that very nice sweet spot where if you know Japan, you know an overseas market, and you have at least one or two hard skills, or some marketing, or not even marketing. Sorry, it's not even marketing. I mean a skill, a professional skill of any sort. On top of that, you're probably very in demand. That's my feel. What do y'all think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to add to that too, you hear a lot about the negatives of being a foreigner who stands out in some way, physically, culturally, and whatever. But speaking of marketing, on the flip side, there's an advantage to that. If you're doing good things, you're automatically marketing yourself. The goal of marketing is to stand out from the crowd. So, to build on what you said, Austin, if you're doing great things, if you specialize and you happen to be a foreigner, you are standing out. So there's two sides to the coin of being non-Japanese.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all of that. I think what's definitely keeping me here is just where I'm at with my business. I really enjoy the work that I do. And I feel like, there's a very specific thing that I can help people with. I think this question, though, I'm starting to think a little differently now that I have a daughter. So I think one of the reasons why I have been, sort of okay with maybe the moments where you feel othered when you're in Japan, or that you're not totally fitting in, is just because I haven't completely grown up in Japan. So I grew up going back and forth between Florida and Tokyo. So even though, I go to a restaurant and I speak to somebody in Japanese, and then they try to give me an English menu or whatever it is, and you think to yourself, oh gosh, I've been trying to, up my game in terms of communication, and, here people are just assuming I need the English menu. Some moments like that are really rough, but then you think, my name is Katheryn Gronauer. I don't really look Japanese unless I tell somebody I'm half Japanese. So all that stuff I can kind of, reason with. But when I look at my daughter, so she kind of genetically got some recessive genes. She actually has blue eyes and very light hair. And she's born and raised in Japan. She is 10 months old now, and she's in daycare, with everything in Japanese. But the moment I pick her up and we go out strolling together, people will look at her and say, so cute, cute or haro, And I'm just wondering what her experience is going to be like growing here. She doesn't have anything to reconcile with. For her, her entire experience is going to be here in Japan. She doesn't have that, I did live in America before, kind of, background for her. So, yeah, we'll see how that goes. To be continued.
To be continued indeed, right? I just want to add a point about networking. And so in the kind of career talks that I give to foreign students in Japan, right, one thing that comes out is, how do you network in Japan? And what I say is that actually you have an easier time networking in Japan than a typical Japanese person, because you are by default in the minority and you are by default memorable. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to increase that. I tell people that the best way that you want to make a Japanese person remember you, go to karaoke with them and sing an enka song. Everybody will remember you that way. All these little hacks here and there. But I mean, I think we kind of restrict ourselves sometimes because of a lack of confidence. Our keigo isn't perfect. Is our meishi, etiquette correct, these kind of things. But in the overall scheme of things, I think we need to realize that we are actually coming with an advantage that the locals may not have in themselves. And that can be leveraged sometimes because you're very memorable just by default.
For sure. And since we're on the topic of networking hacks in general, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that, if anything comes to mind for you guys.
Ooh, I always tell people to try to go to the same networking event like at least 3 times. You know, don't just be like, okay, I'm going to go do this once and, oh no, I didn't meet anybody, you know? So I think that relationship building is something that takes time, and it really requires at least a few touch points. You're not just going to show up at an event and then all of a sudden have a best friend, or, you know, you may or may not get business. But I think the idea of getting like a client, like from the first moment you meet somebody, is a little bit more on the rare side. You need to develop that relationship. So I think if you can think about networking as more kind of a marathon and not a sprint, and try to commit to making at least a few elements of effort before you give up in one specific, you know, networking zone, I think that'll really take you far.
Yeah, I want to back that up 100%, especially here in Japan where business takes longer. A lot of people think networking means I go to some event, I meet someone, I get a sale. That is not true at all. You know, go to the same series of events multiple times. Be inquisitive with the people that you meet. So ask them questions, show interest, but make friends and follow up. So when you meet, when you exchange business cards, if someone is interesting to you, follow up with them and invite them out for coffee or, you know, jogging or cycling or whatever you like to do. And you know, then a relationship builds. They get to know you, you get to know them. And what typically happens, at least for me, is people that I've known for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. After that amount of time, they know me well, and when they have a business problem, then they call me. So it has nothing to do with sales. It puts you in a position where you can help someone and be rewarded for that. So definitely take your time, enjoy it, be inquisitive, and be patient. Yeah.
Much agreed. It's really true that, you know, you only stick in somebody's mind after you met them at least 2 times, right? The first time it's just, I give you my name card and so on and so forth. It doesn't really stick that much. Like, but 2 times and beyond, it really, you start having more like deeper conversations. Like, hey, what was it we talked about last time? Like, you know, how's your business going and these kind of things, right? I want to put a bit of a different spin on this though. So what I also tend to say is that the best networking sometimes doesn't come from from networking opportunities, especially maybe this is more for like the early career side of things, but like, you know, when you're a student or when you are let's say very early in career, first 3 years, right, you may get better networking like volunteering at an animal shelter than actually doing networking for networking's sake, right? Because that's when you sometimes networking is about seeing a random set of like Japanese society, having conversations with this random set of Japanese society. And sometimes like you can, like they may be working in XYZ company and you're like, guess what? I have a job. Do you want this job? So sometimes the randomness is important when we network, I think.
Yeah, there really is a lot of benefit in having a little bit more of a casual relationship with people, because I don't know if this is just my opinion as an American, but networking gets such a rep for being just a transactional thing instead of trying to build relationships for the long term. But I do also definitely agree with the idea of going to the same networking event multiple times. Since I'm researching the startup ecosystem right now, I've been attending a lot of the same sort of events over and over again. And another thing that's really nice about that is you can be the senpai of people who are there for the first time. So you kind of get to show them around. You can introduce them to people. And if you have that sort of friendly relationship with them where you've been able to help them from the beginning, it goes a long way to kind of enhancing your relationship in the future.
Yeah, I guess I would just maybe add one more thing is just follow your curiosity. You don't have to go to a networking event that's completely out of your comfort zone in terms of the topic and the people who are there. You know, just start with what you know or what you're curious about. If you are curious, if you like to go on tours, then maybe just, you know, sign up for tours or something and then just see who you meet through those things. If you're really interested, I was really interested in the health and wellness scene. So I went to like a bunch of macrobiotic restaurants, which are like natural, you know, organic restaurants, and through that process met a lot of people too. So I think if you just start with what you're passionate about or interested in, that'll lead to a lot of relationship building too.
Could I add a quick thing to that, which reveals one of the mistakes and learnings I had about my networking experience is when I first came to Japan and Tokyo, I just went to any business-related networking event I could. But as I got busier, as I stayed here longer and learned, I started to avoid the ones that are just people standing around with a glass of wine. Sure, if that's your thing, go for it. But as you mentioned, Katheryn, it was more interesting, more fun, more rewarding to do something that had an activity or a theme or something like that. And a basic form for people who are interested in business networking is try to choose a networking event that has a presentation. So at least you can go and get some knowledge, even if the crowd doesn't work out for you. So these days, I always prioritize events that have some activity or presentation, and that's something I wish I had known when I first got here.
Yeah, because especially if you are on the more introverted side, the hardest part of networking is just going up to somebody in the first place and starting the conversation. So if you at least have a mutual presentation, a mutual experience that you just had together, it's a lot easier to get things rolling, for sure.
Oh, I have never heard somebody say, "Hey, Katheryn, like, I want to get better at networking, but, I'm an extrovert." Like, no one has ever said that they're an extrovert, and they have trouble with, networking or something. So I can't tell you how many times through coaching I've heard people say, "Oh, I want to meet people, but I'm an introvert." Like, it's hands down like the one thing people identify as. So maybe you don't have to identify yourself as being an introvert. You can just identify yourself as someone who's curious about the topic, and who are you going to meet in that process. You can start from there.
Yeah, and even especially if you're on the more introverted side, just learning how to ask good questions is probably the best thing you can do, because most people want to just talk about themselves anyway to a certain extent. So if you can get really good at asking people about their experiences and cultivating genuine curiosity, people can really pick up on if you're just trying to figure out, ooh, can this person do something for me? Versus like, oh, you're doing such cool things in the world. Please tell me more about that. So yeah, that's definitely a skill that I think is important for anybody to learn. So then kind of going back to what you would wish you had known before you would come to Japan, are there any specific skills, or like before we talked about mindsets, but is there anything a little bit more tangible you wish you had a better hold on before you came to Japan?
I'll dive right in because my answer is simple. Japanese. If I had known, or if I had been a better planner, I would have learned much more Japanese than I did before I came here. I took Japanese as an elective, as a business major for 1 year, which basically enabled me to ask for directions, order food, and get help. If I knew I was going to end up here for 15 plus years, or basically life, I would, as a student, I would have just channeled all of my energy until I was fluent before coming here. And the reason I say that is because knowing Japanese, whether you're an entrepreneur, an employee, whatever, just living life, it accelerates everything you do here. I think people still don't fully realize how important Japanese is here. And, if you're in Tokyo, you can get by with English. But again, just knowing the language makes it easier to do business. You can tie language knowledge to revenue. At least I can. Knowing and being able to do at least some business in Japanese brings me more clients. If you're working, everybody knows you need to have at least N2, probably N1 these days, on the JLPT, the Japanese certification test. So that's the number one skill. Just a straightforward answer this time.
I would maybe add to that and say that one experience I had when I first came here is I chose to live in a share apartment with other Japanese women. And I noticed that I was able to pick up Japanese a lot faster than other students at my school. A lot of the exchange students, they actually didn't really learn a lot of Japanese because they were constantly surrounded by other foreigners, and they were also living in dorms with other foreigners, and they were doing activities with other foreigners. And so I think that one of the biggest values I had early on in my experience in Japan was just really making sure I was choosing activities where I was really just surrounded by Japanese people and how to put myself out there. Luckily, I did have conversational Japanese under my belt, but in terms of things like business Japanese or other topics that I might not use in just day-to-day language, I really tried to put myself in environments where I had no choice but to speak Japanese. So I would probably add that to what Anthony was saying. Mm-hmm.
Enka songs, maybe. No, I just want to go back to the Japanese point. So I did come with a JLPT N1. Even that's not enough often, but just looking at a more broader view about like hiring here in Japan, there was a study by Recruit, I think 3 years ago, which surveyed employers for how much Japanese they expect from their foreign hires. Rough results are that the minimum, around like 75% will demand a minimum of an N2, 20% an N3. So if you don't have an N3, you're pretty much restricted to 2.5% of 5% of the overall hiring market. It's not small, given the fact that this is, after all, the third or fourth, depending on how you count it, biggest economy of the world. But it's restricted heavily to certain sectors: hospitality, IT, and so on and so forth. Right. So that's a part about the Japanese. I do also want to add a more meta perspective, because above Japanese itself, what's also more important is knowing the value that you can provide to this market and what is demanded here. If you're a hotshot engineer and if you can make your own open AI, Japan will hire you off the bat. Even if you have zero Japanese, that's because you have value, right? So I think from an overall career, thinking about your own career perspective, it's like, okay, Japanese is a big accelerant. But if you don't have Japanese, what else can you provide? And whether you can formulate a concrete and coherent answer to that will probably be correlated with your success in your career building here in Japan.
Yeah, definitely. And even just looking at expats who may be in a situation where their company sends them over, they're in a completely English-speaking environment. They know for a fact that they're not going to be moving into a Japanese-speaking environment. I'm sure that you've seen this in your work, Katheryn, where even if once you get to a higher level of Japanese, the psychological weight of dealing with the language every day and just going to the grocery store, figuring out how to get directions, figuring out how to read all the mail that's coming at you all the time that you don't know what's going on, but you know it's important. So just being able to lighten that psychological load, even if you're just working in an English-speaking environment, probably helps to set you more up for success.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's kind of different profiles of people I've worked with. There's some people who know they're only going to be here maybe 3 to 5 years, and some of their attitudes are just what's the point of learning Japanese if I'm just going to leave after a short amount of time. But honestly, it really just makes a huge difference. And also, I think to the other people who you work with, if they can tell that you can understand some of the language, that really helps kind of break the ice and just make people feel a lot more relaxed, because they feel like they can go back to, adding in some Japanese words here and there. I can't tell you how many Japanese people I've worked with who really, I think, just first and foremost worry about using English in global settings. So they're not really concerned about things like speed of how fast they're working or objectives or taking ownership or any of those things that you might consider are important in global settings. Their primary concern is really just the language. So yeah, I think if you can show them that you have some knowledge or command of Japanese, that really helps kind of set the tone in a positive way.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's been your experience as well, but I feel like when you are speaking to somebody in Japanese, or if they just know that you know how to speak Japanese, they're also more willing to speak English, because they know that okay, we're both kind of on shaky footing here, but we'll just do whatever we can to communicate. So yeah, it definitely goes a long way to building rapport. So then just looking forward a little bit, I was wondering, with everything changing so quickly post-COVID, and then now with all of the buzz around generative AI and all the things that are changing in the work market too, how do you see Japan changing in the future? Or how has it been changing since COVID? Because I feel like it's hard to even understand the before and after at this point.
I think COVID was obviously a very horrible thing that's happened, but I think for Japan, it was such a necessary thing in terms of how it's impacted how people work. Before the pandemic, there was, plenty of companies outside of Japan that might have been getting more used to things like flex time, or remote work that was kind of on the rise. But in Japan, it was just like, oh, how are we going to get our documents stamped? We can't possibly have people work from home, So I think you need something big like that to really force Japan to kind of, implement change. That's been kind of buzzwords that you hear about. So I am really questioning how things are going to be changing going forward. I do think one thing that has been on my mind, I don't know about anybody else's, but it's about the yen that's weakening right now. So I wonder how that's going to impact the job market, bringing, Japan really needs talent, really needs people to be working. So they want to attract people from other countries to come here. But if the yen is so weak and the salaries aren't changing, how is that going to impact, just the labor market and things like that? So that's also something that I'm continuing to look at.
I guess on that point, looking at the labor market and bringing in people from Japan, right? To Japan. It's kind of interesting. So when we look at the white collar section of hiring here in Japan, Japan's relative attractiveness has definitely gone down versus a few years ago. And much of this is the yen that is crashing, right? But if we look at the overall labor market, right, the number of foreigners overall who are working in Japan has increased. And if you look at the nationalities, the biggest growing components are Vietnam and Nepal. Because no matter what, if you're there's such a big economic differential between these countries and Japan right now that even if the yen goes down by 30%, there's already a 10x difference between the home countries and here in Japan. That is unlikely to change in the near future, I think. And so we will see this still. But for the white collar section, this is going to be a bit of an issue, because right now Japan, because of the weekend, needs to export, and some part of exportation clearly involves white collar work, marketing, localization, going to the if it's B2B, it's actually overseas sales, right? And whether Japan is going to be able to attract and retain these sectors, these segments of talent that will allow them to make the best of the weekend is a question mark in my mind right now.
Yeah, I had the same thoughts as both Katheryn and Austin about all of this. So I want to introduce a new dimension, and this has to do with the domestic situation. Japanese workers, mainly white collar. So when I was working with the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan, one of our big policy pushes was to increase labor mobility, the ability for people to change jobs to advance their salary and their quality of life. And as recently as 8 to 10 years ago, that was incredibly low here in Japan. It was all about the lifetime employment. And now, through the demographic crisis, the changes in the economy, and all of these things, the labor shortages, you're seeing people changing jobs to get the jobs that offer them the best benefits. You're seeing more people creating startups than ever before. Because before, if you quit your job, if you got off of that lifetime track, it was very hard to recover. But now, the risk has been reduced. You can change your job if your business doesn't work out, or if the new job doesn't work out, you can find a better one. You can find another one. And so I'm excited, cautiously excited, that this situation might increase that workforce mobility, and hopefully it will encourage more people to create businesses and do startups, and hopefully we can see Japan innovating again. And this ties into the work of Richard Katz, who we're all famous, we're all fans of. So, you know, if you read his work, I believe he also talks about this as well. So that's the future I'm excited about.
Yeah, for sure. And it looks like it's about time for us to take a break. So if you want to go ahead and get a drink, we will reconvene shortly for a Q&A session. So be sure to think of anything you want to ask and add to the conversation. Thank you. All right. Since we had a little bit of time to get refreshed and re-energize a little bit, was there anything that kind of you wanted to add to today's conversation that maybe we didn't get to discuss, or any questions from the audience?
Actually, there's one question for you, Lydia. So why do you do this podcast?
That is a good question with not such a good answer. So basically, before the pandemic, I had been teaching basic like Japanese etiquette to business people who came to Japan for just work. So they just needed a really baseline idea of what am I going to experience in Japan? What do I need to know? How can I be more successful there? So originally it was just a audio version of the course curriculum, but because of the pandemic, I ran out of content. So I eventually just started interviewing people. My original guest was Kasha Lynch, and she was kind enough to open her network to me, which is how I connected with Anthony. And it's just kind of snowballed from there. And since then, it's just been, of course, personally, it's been a very good way for me to build specific skills, interviewing skills, marketing skills, copywriting, just being able to get more experience as a content creator per se. Well, sounds a little bit arrogant, but yes, there are skills involved. And then from there, it's just been a really good way to grow my network in a way that feels beneficial to three parties. So beneficial to me, beneficial to my guest, and then beneficial to anybody who happens to be able to listen to the podcast. So it's just been, especially as an introvert, it's been a much easier way to be able to reach out to people and connect.
I love that, because we were talking about networking before, and you basically highlighted one way to network with just talking to people one-on-one and using, social media to kind of spread that. And it's a very different context than actually going to an event with a lot of people to interact with. So yeah, I think that's just one takeaway I have from what you're saying.
Yeah, for sure. And at least for me, I probably just have a complex about this where it's really hard for me to ask people for their time. But if you can make it a win-win situation, it's a lot less intimidating to actually reach out and connect. So something I recommend to anybody else who has like a blog or any other creative project they want to start. It's a great networking tool.
It's like there's a saying that the best diet is something that it's the diet that you can sustain, right? And the same applies with networking, doesn't it? Like, the best kind of networking is the networking that you can sustain. And I think in the pre-show discussion, none of the speakers here up here actually identify ourselves as extroverts, full extroverts at all. No. So there is a way to make it work. Yeah.
I'm a learned extrovert.
No, it is definitely a skill set. And I think that's what makes it so intimidating to people who it doesn't come naturally to, is because you see people who look like they're naturals, but it's a skill set. So yes, there are a few people who are just naturally charming and can make friends with anyone, but it's rarer than you think. So just build the skill as much as you can.
Yeah, that is a point I wanted to come back to and stress that, a lot of these things, being extroverted, at least for a brief amount of time, learning to be curious about people, being inquisitive, these are skills that we can develop. We can read books, we can practice, we can try to find interesting things about people, interesting things to ask. So, I'm glad we brought that up. For anyone listening, if you feel that you have a weakness or something you can't accomplish, a lot of these things are skills that you have to develop. And certain career paths, or especially entrepreneurship, force you to develop these skills. Otherwise, you can't survive. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word weakness, and something that's really interesting about that is a lot of times if you are aware of something that feels like a shortcoming, a lot of the conventional wisdom is just keep at it, keep fighting, keep making it work, fight. But in reality, there are ways to be a little bit kinder to yourself and experiment with things that work a little bit more naturally. And if it's a method that's a more natural fit for you, again, it'll be more sustainable and it will probably be more effective too. So nothing is one size fits all. So yeah, did anybody in the audience have any additional questions for the panelists?
Thank you so much. So I know earlier we talked, or you guys talked a little bit about the language barrier and cultural differences. But that aside, thus far, can you talk about one of the biggest challenges you faced and how you tackled it when you transitioned to your current role or where you're going next?
I guess it goes back to the thing I said just now about Keigo and stuff, right? I think it's very natural for us to have a bit of an imposter syndrome when we're working in Japan. The sense that my Keigo is not good enough, or my hard skills are not good enough, or XYZ, and you kind of feel like, why am I here? Why do I have, what gives me the right to do this? And not to mention that I was like a political science engineer, like my code is not the best, and these kind of things, right? But I think it's sometimes just giving yourself the space to just try things and wing it, because sometimes you learn by winging it. And maybe there's a part here in Japanese society which kind of makes you think that you need to be perfectionist, because this is a very mistake-averse society, and that may bleed into our mentalities as well. But yeah, I think giving yourself the space to make mistakes and to pick yourself up from them has been a kind of a challenge for me at the beginning. Yeah.
Okay, I have another. There are many challenges, but I have another one to bring up that's a little bit different. In a recent coaching session, the topic of homesickness came up. And I don't feel that I felt the traditional bout of homesickness that comes up at a certain time. However, the longer I stay here and the deeper the roots go, it's definitely a challenge to deal with being here and being away from very close friends and family for a very long time. So, it's a challenge balancing how long can I stay in the States, for example? What kind of job will allow me to be there for people back home, friends and family and things like that? I think entrepreneurship helps with that. But if you're looking to prepare yourself for challenges, if you're going to be here forever, people get older. People have life events like weddings and children that you might miss out on. And you really have to think carefully how you're going to navigate that. And the longer you stay here, the more challenging that gets. Do I have advice? I'm still working on it. Fortunately, I can work remotely, which allows me to spend up to a month in the States with friends and family. That helps. In the earlier stages, I think instead of just telling your friends and family, okay, let's keep in touch and do random Skype calls, put it in your calendar. Make a schedule. Say every week we're going to have a Zoom call if that's your thing. If you like games, every week we're going to get together, chat while playing some online games or something like that, and lock it in your calendar. That definitely helps in the earlier stages. The later stages, I'm still working that out. But if you have a way to, spend significant time abroad, that certainly helps. So my goal is to spend as much time with friends and family in the States as people in the United States are spending with their friends and family. For example, people who live in California probably see their relatives in Washington, D.C. once or twice a year. So I'm trying to match that even though I live in Japan. So that's a new challenge. I hope that answers your question. That helps.
I have a couple of challenges I'm facing right now. I'm also hoping that this is kind of along what you're thinking about in terms of what a challenge could look like. So one of them is more kind of my day-to-day. So I've been, my daughter is now 10 months old. So I basically had a transition from being, an entrepreneur working full time to then trying to figure out, okay, how do I have a baby and work and, figure all of this out. So I think just trying to think about what the main priorities are and being more open to asking for help. And just trying to be a little bit kinder to myself. The type of work style I had before having a baby and after has been very different. So I think that's kind of more just my day-to-day has just really changed. And, just being proud of the things I've been able to accomplish while things have been in the process of change as well. And I think that's also really humbled me too in terms of the people I work with who are also going through a transition. So, just knowing that your transition is going to have a certain amount of steps. It's not permanent, the things that you're experiencing. So when you're going through or experiencing transition, there's always going to be some type of end, or there's light at the end of the tunnel, I guess you could say. The other challenge I'm facing right now is I'm actually writing about my experiences that I had growing up with my Japanese side of the family, who are bathhouse owners. So bathhouse in Japan, or Japanese, is sento. So I grew up with generations of family members in the bathhouse business, and I am currently writing about how that experience is connected to personal development. So whenever people ask me what is it like to start a business, the first thing I always think of is, it's a lot like going to a sento. Like you feel naked and you're like, what do I do with that experience of vulnerability, essentially? So it's like, doing things that you feel very passionate about. A lot of times on a daily basis, it feels like being naked, being exposed, and it's literally a skill that you can develop. And I think that really ties a lot to what we've been talking about, things like networking, about putting yourself out there. It is a skill or a routine that you can build, and that's very similar to the steps you might take with public bathing. So trying to marry those two topics, personal development and sentos, is my current challenge, but it's somehow coming together.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Was there anything else that we wanted to dig a little bit deeper on or ask any questions about?
Thank you so much. This has been very informative. I have a question about what you would say to someone who is maybe at a crossroads. Maybe they've done study abroad in Japan and they're deciding whether or not they want to stay here long term, or maybe they're even deciding whether or not to study abroad in Japan with plans to stay here long term. And they're not sure if this culture shock, this Japan angst is like they feel a little bit threatened by that, and they kind of want to go back home. What would you say to them? How would you help them make that decision? Thank you.
I usually just ask people, like, what are you curious about? So I think usually when people have a dilemma, if you can try to take them out of the what ifs and just say, okay, if you had a totally blank slate, like, what would you be doing? Or if you were just asking yourself, what would I want to wake up doing tomorrow? What would that be? So just trying to take the weight out of that question and just like really make it more simple about like how you're feeling, because all of the details will work themselves out. And I think that as long as you're following your curiosity in some way, the people who you would want to build relationships with, the situations that would be the most ideal for you, that will all kind of unfold. So yeah, just going back to those kind of two simple questions. What would I do if I just had a blank slate? And what am I curious about?
I would probably approach them with a similar approach that I had when I came to Japan. Believe it or not, as much as I love the country, I had vacationed here twice before living here, I was still apprehensive. I have to give credit to my friends and family and mentors who basically pushed me here kicking and screaming. Not because I was against Japan in any way, I loved it, but I really had to basically derail my career to come here. So I'm very risk averse. I had never lived out of Southern California before, let alone abroad. So ultimately, to get here, I told myself, and many other people told me, it's just 1 year. Just try 1 year. See what happens. If you don't like it, you can come back. You can get your regular job and just be a regular Californian, whatever that is. So I would tell that person the same thing. I would say, do you think you can handle 1 more year here? If so, just give it a try. See what happens. And it's really a short time in the grand scheme of things. And if after that year you're still feeling like, returning to your country or doing something different, then you can do that with a little bit more confidence. However, on the other hand, you could end up like me, where 1 year turns into 15. So in summary, I would just tell them, or I would ask them, can you handle 1 more year? If so, go for it.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, this question's like brought up lots of like complex thoughts in my head, and I think the first thing I want to preface things by saying is that the correct response to living in Japan is gray. It's always gray. If it's fully white or fully black, something's a bit wrong down here, because the thing is there's going to be a lot of things that we respond to positively and negatively. Sometimes we will vacillate between the two, and that's just normal. Like, that's what we have back at home as well, right? Like, so just sitting with that and understanding that there will be bad days, there will be good days, and this is just giving yourself some forgiveness for feeling bad sometimes. I think it starts from there. But then, yeah, I think it's going back to what's instinctual. If the homesickness is really, really very strong, please go home. That's not good for your mental health, for you to try to keep fighting against that, right? So I think it's kind of like being in touch with your curiosity, your emotional state. If you feel very isolated here, then maybe that's a sign. Maybe that's not. I don't know. There's no correct answers to that, right? Yeah, but I just sit with the gray and see how gray it is, and if it's less, if it's a glass half full or empty, well, that's your own decision, right? But staying in Japan in itself must be a conscious choice. The danger of staying in Japan for and just letting it go because it's the default, right, is that sometimes some people will get very embittered by the whole thing, just staying here for too long, and out of nowhere I'm in this state and I can't go back. But take agency. I feel take agency over your choice to be here, your work here, and things like that. And if looking at the overall scheme of things, it doesn't look like it's panning out, go home. We can always go home. Yeah, not always. Some people are different. Yeah, it's some circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the best way to articulate it is what you said, kind of just stay awake to the decisions you're making, because deciding to stay is also making a very intense decision. And kind of the imperfect parallel I'm thinking about is like a marriage. Like if you just passively stay in your relationship because it's too annoying to have to leave and move on, and I have to date other people, that sounds terrible. But but being able to wake up and say, okay, is this the life that I want to continue living? Is this where I want to continue pouring my soul, my time, my energy? Or do I want to go ahead and try something else? Is it worth the risk to move into something else or not? I think is a good way to think about it.
Could I add one more corollary to this? So I do a lot of work writing about startups and startup ecosystems. That's a big part of my client base. And one of the cool things about that is I learn about all of these fascinating startup ecosystems in smaller countries, usually Europe, such as Georgia. I just finished a project writing about Georgia. And they have all of these incentives for people to come over there and work. Estonia is another great example where it's, it seems super easy to just to go out there and start a business. So I just wanted to say that we're often talking binary, Japan or our home country. But the world's a big place. So that, think on another dimension. Maybe if you're on the fence about Japan or, your home country, maybe there's other countries out there that will be better than them both. So that's just one quick thing I want to add. This is a multi-dimensional issue.
Yeah, and I do think it's important to make sure that you're not thinking of it as a binary, because again, you can move to a completely different country and your Japan experience was not a waste, because then suddenly you can also act as a go-between for that country, which is not your home country, and Japan itself. So even if it's just how you've changed as a person over the years that you spent in Japan, it's really important to not get into the mindset of, oh, if I don't do this certain thing, if I don't have this certain experience, it was a waste. Because as long as you've been intentional about your experience there, I don't think it would ever be a waste. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for coming out to see us. I hope that you all have a great rest of your weekend and enjoy the pleasant temperature while it lasts, because it's about to be summer. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
you so
very
much.
Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed this week's very special recording. If you enjoyed the episode, go ahead and share it with a friend, colleague, or connection on LinkedIn to help spread the perspectives and information shared in the podcast. And please remember to go ahead and subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're using, and also leave a rating and review if you enjoyed the podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, there are a few things that you can do. You can support the podcast using the listener support button on Spotify for podcasters or contribute yourself on my Ko-fi page. You can find the link to do so in the description of this episode. I'd love to hear from you directly, so if you'd like to leave a voice message, you can find the link to do that in the description as well. But for now, remember that the more you learn, the more confident you will become as you explore all of the opportunities Japan has to offer you. Until next time, mata kondo.